I got a motion alert on my phone at 3:14 a.m. on a Friday, and when I checked the ring footage, there was a man standing on the front porch wearing the homeowner's red flannel jacket, the same jacket I'd seen hanging in their bedroom closet that afternoon. The jacket wasn't in the closet anymore. He just stood there for 11 seconds, completely motionless, like he was waiting for something, and then he turned and walked off camera to the left. I didn't sleep after that. I didn't sleep for the next 3 nights. My name is Jess Kowalczyk. I'm 26 years old, a veterinary technician at a small animal clinic on Madison's west side. I grew up in Wausau, Wisconsin, about an hour and a half south of where this all happened. I moved to Madison when I was 18 to go to vet tech school at Madison College, and I've been working at the clinic for almost 4 years now. The job is stable, the work is good, the pay is adequate. It's not enough to live alone comfortably on, though, so I picked up rover gigs on weekends, pet sitting, dog walking, cat sitting, overnight stays in suburban homes. I'd done almost 30 jobs in 2 years, mostly golden retrievers and anxious rescue mutts, a few temperamental cats that made it clear they'd prefer I wasn't in their house. It was easy money usually, low stakes. I liked it because I got to work with animals outside the clinical setting, and I controlled my own schedule. Just book the job through the app, show up, follow the owner's instructions, collect the check. It was straightforward, but I'd never done an overnight stay at a remote property before. The Lindgrens, a retired couple in their late 60s, nice people, warm, had found me through Rover and booked me for a 3-week pet-sitting job while they were in Florida. They had 2 golden retrievers, Benny and Scout. Beautiful dogs, well-trained, affectionate without being overwhelming. The lake house was on Squirrel Lake, outside Minocqua, Wisconsin, up in the Northwoods. County Road J was the address, and when I drove up there from Madison on a Thursday afternoon in March, I could feel the landscape changing. The suburban sprawl fell away. There were more pine trees than houses, gravel roads with mailboxes at the end of long driveways. I passed the Bearskin State Trail entrance, crossed Highway 51, and kept going deeper into the woods until I found the right turnoff. Their nearest neighbor was probably half a mile away, maybe more. The kind of place where sound travels differently, where quiet has weight. The lake house itself was a big 1990s A-frame with weathered cedar siding, a wraparound deck, a detached 2-car garage with a side entrance, and a wooden dock leading down to the water. It was genuinely beautiful, the kind of place people dream about when they're tired. I could see why the Lindgrens loved it, pine trees everywhere, the lake reflecting the gray March sky, that particular silence of a property where no other humans lived close by. The kind of silence that sounds like absence. I arrived around 2 p.m. The Lindgrens showed me around. The kitchen, the master bedroom, the living room that opened onto the deck, the garage, the smart home system in the laundry room. They gave me the garage door code, the door lock codes, the smart home app access so I could lock and unlock the doors remotely if I needed to. They showed me where the dog's food and toys were, gave me their vet's number, left me detailed written instructions about feeding schedules and walking routes, and where the flashlight was, and which door stuck and which light switch sometimes flickered. They were thorough and kind. They had a flight to Sarasota at 5:15 p.m. We had about an hour together. They showed me the red flannel jacket in their bedroom closet. Not directly. I just noticed it hanging there when I was putting my overnight bag in the guest room. It was a nice jacket, red and black checked, looked like the kind of thing you'd wear to work in the woods. I didn't think about it much at the time. The Lindgrens left around 3:30 p.m. I waved them off, and then it was just me and Benny and Scout in a big lake house in the Northwoods. I fed the dogs at 5 p.m. like they'd instructed, took them out on the deck, watched them run down to the lake's edge. They were excited to have the place to themselves with someone they knew. The sun was setting over the water by 6, that strange early March darkness that comes so fast. The house had these enormous floor-to-ceiling windows in the main hallway, and you could see the lake turning from gray to black as the light left. That first night was normal, genuinely normal. I made myself dinner, fed the dogs again at 8, took them out one more time before bed. The house made settling sounds. Old houses talk to themselves, especially when they're this big and this empty. Pipes settling, the deck wood expanding and contracting in the cool evening. It was the kind of place where those sounds are normal and expected. Around 10 p.m., I got ready for bed in one of the guest rooms upstairs, made sure the dogs had water, double-checked that the back doors were locked. I set my phone on the nightstand and fell asleep around 11. The motion alert came at 3:14 a.m. The phone buzzed against the wooden nightstand, a sound that cuts through sleep in a way few things do. I woke up confused, the way you do when something pulls you from deep sleep. My eyes felt gummy. For a few seconds, I didn't even know where I was. Then the phone buzzed again, another notification maybe, and I remembered. Lake House. Benny and Scout downstairs, Minocqua. I unlocked my phone. There was a motion alert from the Ring doorbell camera on the front porch. Timestamp 3:13 a.m. I tapped the notification and the video began playing. There was a man on the porch, mid-30s maybe, stocky build, maybe 5'10", wearing jeans and a heavy jacket, a red and black checked flannel jacket, the same jacket from the Lindgren's closet. I watched it through twice, once in real time, once again. He stood completely motionless for 11 seconds, not looking at anything, not doing anything, just standing there facing the house like he was waiting for something. He didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't shift his weight, just stood there. And then he turned to his left and walked out of frame. I got out of bed. My heart was going at a pace that didn't match the circumstance, but I couldn't stop it. I checked the other Ring cameras, the back porch camera, the garage side door camera, and didn't see anything. I went to the master bedroom where I'd seen the jacket hanging in the closet that afternoon. The closet was open. The jacket wasn't there. I checked again, running my hand across the wooden hangers. Nothing. The jacket had been inside a locked house, and now it was on a man walking around the property at 3:14 a.m. I didn't call the police. In hindsight, that was stupid. Obviously stupid. But at the time I thought, what am I going to tell them? Someone walked on my client's porch? Someone is wearing a jacket? They'd think I was panicked and imagining things. And besides, Benny and Scout were asleep downstairs. If someone had come to the house with actual bad intent, wouldn't the dogs have reacted? Wouldn't they have barked, growled, something? Golden retrievers are friendly dogs, sure, but they're not stupid. They notice when strangers are on the property. And they hadn't made a sound. So instead, I sat in the dark living room with my phone in my hand, watching the footage again and again, zooming in on the man's face, trying to see if I recognized him. I didn't. I didn't know who he was. I watched it until the sun started to come up, until the sky over the lake shifted from black to dark blue to gray, and Benny started rustling around, ready for his morning walk. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I fed the dogs, took them out on the deck, walked them down the gravel path toward the lake. The sun on the water was actually beautiful, this pale March sun that doesn't warm anything but feels good anyway. I told myself that I'd been half asleep when I watched the video, probably misinterpreting what I saw. Maybe it was an old jacket the Lindgrens had given away to someone. Maybe it had been outside already and I'd just forgotten. Maybe there was a completely rational explanation. People lived out here. It wasn't impossible that someone had walked by. People took walks. The Lindgrens had mentioned the bearskin trail wasn't far. Maybe he was a hiker who'd gotten lost. Maybe he'd knocked on the wrong cabin by accident. But that afternoon, when I went to the garage to move my car closer to the side door, I'd parked it near the driveway when I arrived, and I wanted it more visible in case I needed to leave. I found muddy boot prints on the concrete floor. They came from the large side entry door and tracked deep into the garage, toward the interior door that connected to the house. Recent prints. Wet dark, like they'd been made within the last 12 hours. And in the living room, when I came back inside, one of the chairs had been moved. I was certain of it. There was a high-backed leather chair that had been angled to face the bay windows toward the lake. Now it was facing inward, toward the hallway and the interior of the house, facing into the house instead of out toward the water. When I tried to take Benny and Scout into the garage, they wouldn't go. I called them. They trotted toward me and then just stopped at the threshold to the garage, planted their paws on the concrete, and pulled back toward the house, whining. Scout actually whined, a high, anxious sound I hadn't heard from either dog since I'd arrived. Dogs know things. They sense territory and threat and presence in ways humans don't. These were happy, well-trained, sociable golden retrievers, and they were genuinely afraid of that garage. I didn't go into the garage that night. I didn't want to know what else might be different in there. I locked all the doors. The smart home app let me lock and unlock the house remotely, and I locked the front door, the back door, the garage side door, all of it, and then I went back and locked everything twice more, even though I knew they were already locked. It was a pointless gesture, but it made me feel slightly less exposed. I made the dogs stay in my room when I went to bed. They didn't usually sleep in the guest rooms, but I didn't ask and they didn't object. I kept my phone charged and on the nightstand, screen brightness all the way up. I tried to read, but the words didn't stick. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't turn my brain off. Every sound the house made sounded like footsteps. Every creak sounded intentional. The second motion alert came at 11:47 p.m. The man was back. This time he wasn't standing still. He was trying the front door handle, pulling on it, testing it, yanking it, like he was checking whether it was actually locked. The footage showed about 20 seconds of this, him working the handle, then he turned toward the camera and the video cut off. But the Ring app had audio, and I could hear his breathing through the speaker. His footsteps were deliberately loud on the porch boards. He walked the full perimeter of the wraparound deck, and I heard every step. The boards creaked under his weight in a pattern, left side, front, right side, back. He was walking around the entire house, testing, checking, looking for entry. I grabbed both dogs. They came immediately, like they understood something had shifted, and I pulled them with me to the master bedroom and locked the door behind us. Benny and Scout jumped on the bed without being invited, and I pulled the covers over all three of us and sat there in the dark, my phone screen in one hand, the dog's collar in the other. My hands were shaking. I could hear his footsteps on the deck still, pacing now, getting faster, like he was getting frustrated. And then I called 911. The dispatcher was calm and professional in that way emergency operators are trained to be. Her name was Patricia. I told her I was a pet sitter at a remote property on County Road J, outside Minocqua. There was an intruder trying the doors. He'd been caught on my Ring camera twice in 2 days. She stayed on the line. She confirmed my location, asked how many people were in the house, just me and 2 dogs, asked if I felt immediately threatened. I said no. He was outside. Doors were locked. And she told me that police would be dispatched from Minocqua and would be there in approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes. The house was very quiet except for my breathing and the dog shifting on the bed. I could hear him outside still, pacing, his footsteps on the deck, and it was like those seconds stretched out. 12 minutes felt like days. I watched the Ring camera feed on my phone while Patricia stayed on the line, asking me questions to keep me talking, to keep my mind occupied. She asked me my name, how long I'd been in the house, what I did for work. I told her about being a vet tech, about Rover, about this being my first overnight remote job. She listened and didn't interrupt, and I was grateful for that. The police arrived at 11:59 p.m. according to the timestamp on my phone. 2 cars, lights flashing but no siren. I heard car doors open, heard officers calling out, demanding the man identify himself, demanding he show his hands. And then there was a long quiet, and I realized what that meant. They'd found him. He was in the garage when they arrested him. They found him sitting in a lawn chair, one of the Lindgrens' folding lawn chairs that had been in the garage corner, sitting there in the dark wearing more of the homeowner's clothes. A sweater that belonged to Mr. Lindgren, jeans that were definitely not his, a wool hat. He had a copy of the garage door code. He'd let himself in through the garage using the code, the same code the Lindgrens had given me that afternoon, the same code he'd memorized months ago when he was a tenant. His name was Kyle Lindgren, no relation to the homeowners, same last name, different family. He'd been the tenant at the lake house for 2 years before the owners retired and moved back north from Florida. He'd been evicted 8 months ago for non-payment of rent and property damage, and he'd been coming back periodically. letting himself in through the garage, wearing their clothes, sitting in their chairs, sleeping in their bed sometimes, acting like the house still belonged to him. When the officers asked him what he was doing there, what he was doing walking around at 3 in the morning, wearing the homeowner's clothes, he kept saying the same thing. It was his house. He'd rented it. He lived there. The owners had moved away, but the house was his. He had a right to be there. He didn't understand why he wasn't allowed in. He wasn't violent when they arrested him. He didn't resist or run or fight. He just kept saying it was his, that he'd been living there, that someone had taken his place. One of the officers stayed with me while I packed my things. He made sure I was okay, made sure I had a safe route home. I left that night with Benny and Scout in my car, both dogs asleep in the back seat, and I drove back to Madison in the dark. The Lindgrens came back from Florida 3 days later. The police contacted them while they were still in Sarasota. They were devastated, not just by the intrusion, but by the realization of what had been happening. Kyle had been accessing the house for months. He'd touched everything. He'd slept in their bed. He'd worn their clothes, used their towels, eaten food from their refrigerator. He'd lived there in their absence, in their space, pretending it was still his. The investigation took weeks. The police recovered items he'd brought into the house, a blanket from somewhere else, a cooler with food. He'd been coming back, living there when no one was home, waiting for the Lindgrens to return. The Lindgrens changed the garage code. They changed every door code. They upgraded their smart home system. They hired a security company to come check the property. But they were frightened now, in their own house, and I could hear it when they called me to apologize for what had happened, even though none of it was their fault. I still do rover jobs. I'm more careful now. I request a full security walkthrough before I book any overnight stay at a remote property. I ask about tenant history, code changes, previous access, whether anyone else might have keys or codes. I've had people not like it, but I don't care. That's my condition now. And I suggest, I write it in emails to Rover support. I say it to anyone who will listen, that Rover should require hosts to confirm security protocols before they can book overnight stays, that landlords should be required to document code changes when tenants move out, especially evicted tenants, that pet sitters staying remote should have formal walkthrough checklists. The educational takeaway here is simple and urgent. If you own property that you've rented out, change the garage codes, door codes, keypad codes, and smart home access when tenants move out. All of it. Not some of it. All of it. Even if you think it's fine, even if you think they were good tenants, even if you trust them. Evicted or not, change everything. And if you're a pet sitter, if you're staying overnight at a remote property, demand that full walkthrough. Make it a condition of your service. Don't be like me that first night, alone in a dark lake house on Squirrel Lake, watching footage of a man wearing someone else's jacket, telling yourself it was probably nothing, that there was definitely an explanation, that you were being paranoid. It wasn't nothing. It was a man who'd been living in that house in his head for 8 months, treating it like it was still his, like he belonged there. And he was furious that someone had taken his place. On day 4 of watching someone else's dogs, they started refusing to enter the guest bedroom where I was sleeping. Both of them, Coda and Juniper, 2 blue Merle Australian shepherds, would stand at the threshold and just bark. Not at me, at the closet. When I opened it to investigate, I found something impossible. Muddy boot prints on the floor, still damp to the touch, leading to an attic hatch in the ceiling that the homeowners had specifically told me didn't exist. My name is Mariana Espinoza. I'm 29, a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of New Mexico, and I was supposed to be spending 3 weeks at a quiet adobe ranch house outside Taos, watching 2 dogs, a cat, and absolutely nothing else. I house sit through trusted house sitters during summer breaks. It's cheaper than paying Albuquerque rent while I'm writing my dissertation on household labor practices in rural New Mexico. The irony wasn't lost on me. I study how people live and work in their homes, how people's daily labor shapes the spaces they inhabit. Now I was living in someone else's for the first time at a property this isolated, learning that observation cuts both directions. The adobe sat on 5 acres about 20 minutes north of Taos, off Highway 68 near Blueberry Hill Road, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains sharp against the sky to the east. Single story, thick walls, saltillo tile floors, a kiva fireplace that hadn't been used in months. The owners, the Callahans, had left for Portugal that morning. The casita out back was their art studio, locked and empty. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road. I'd thought I was renting peace and quiet. Instead, I'd rented a problem I couldn't see yet. The first 3 days had been perfect. Coda and Juniper were gentle, overgrown goofballs who wanted to herd everything, including me, across the property. They'd corner you against the fence and just hold you there with soft eyes, waiting for you to do something interesting. Miso, the house cat, was indifferent to all of us, a superior presence who acknowledged my feeding efforts with the bare minimum of gratitude, preferring to disappear into the piñon trees at dusk and return when she felt like it. I'd settled into a rhythm. Morning walk with the dogs around the perimeter fence, afternoon reading in the living room where the light came in golden and thick through the windows, evenings on the back patio watching the light drain from the Sangre de Cristos, the mountains turning bruised purple and then black. The adobe held the day's heat in its thick walls that were maybe 2 feet deep, built from earth and straw and time, insulated by the geology of the region itself. It was comfortable in a way Albuquerque apartments never were, remote too. That comfort came with a cost I didn't understand yet. Isolation makes you vulnerable in ways you can't articulate until something proves it to you, until something uses your aloneness against you. On day 4, I woke to barking. Not the play barking the dogs did when a bird flew past the fence. This was different, urgent, focused, a warning. I rolled out of bed and saw them both at the bedroom door, pointing their long snouts at the closet like it had personally offended them. Both dogs were stiff-legged, fur raised along their backs, and Juniper was doing something I'd never seen her do before, growling low in her chest, a sound that made the small hairs on my arms stand up. I pulled the closet door open, expecting to find a snake or a scorpion, something that justified the intensity of their reaction. What I found instead was red clay mud, the distinctive color of Taos soil, unique to this region with its iron oxide content and ancient volcanic base, tracked across the tile floor in a clear path. Wet, still damp. The prints were boot-sized, a man's size probably, and they led from the closet corner straight up to the ceiling where I'd never noticed an attic hatch before. A wooden panel, maybe 2 feet square, with a handle screwed into the frame, the wood around it recently disturbed. Dust patterns suggesting recent movement. I stood there staring at it, my sleep-stupid brain working to catch up. The Callahans had been very clear during the walkthrough. No attic access, no basement, no crawl spaces. Single-story adobe, built 60 years ago, nothing hidden. They'd been thorough about it, almost apologetic. Nothing to worry about, no surprises. This hatch was a surprise. This hatch shouldn't exist. I didn't open it. I'm not an idiot. I closed the closet, called the Callahans, and got the same response. What attic? There is no attic access in that bedroom. Are you sure? Yes, I was sure. I was looking at it. They apologized, suggested maybe it was something from a previous owner, maybe it was sealed, maybe it was just a vent cover that looked like something else. They were in Lisbon, 8 hours ahead, and I could hear their confusion even across the ocean. They promised to call back after they found the house plans. Their tone shifted, though, from apologetic to something sharper, something like concern they didn't want to voice. I didn't push them. I didn't mention the muddy footprints. I hung up and spent the rest of the morning doing what anthropology has trained me to do. Observe, document, look for context. I pulled out the notebook I use for field research. Yes, I keep one. We all do in my program. And I started mapping the property systematically. The adobe had a roof hatch on the back of the house, visible from the patio if you knew to look for it. I'd barely noticed it during the Callahans' walkthrough, just a standard maintenance access, rusted, probably original, the kind of thing you see on every house in the high desert. But now I examined it properly. The rust wasn't uniform. There were clean spots on the frame where hands had gripped it, where the oxidation had been rubbed away. The hinge wasn't frozen. It moved when I tested it, not far. The Callahans hadn't given me permission to fully open it, but enough to confirm that it had been used recently. The frame around it showed recent disturbance, the kind of wear that comes from regular opening and closing from someone who'd made a habit of using it. I checked the casita, found nothing inside but paint supplies and drop cloths, brushes soaking in jars of turpentine that had probably been there for weeks. The Callahans used it as an art studio when they were home, but they were gone now, and the space felt abandoned, smelling of old oil and dust. I walked the fence line methodically, looking for breaks or loose sections, and found nothing. No gap big enough for a human to squeeze through. No disturbed earth suggesting digging. No cut wire. The property was sealed, locked from the outside. Whatever was moving in the attic had come through the roof. The dogs, meanwhile, had moved on. Coda was napping in a patch of sun on the saltillo tiles, her breathing deep and calm, one ear twitching at flies. Juniper was staring at something in the pinon trees near the edge of the property, her body alert but her behavior shifted back to normal, curiosity instead of warning. Whatever had upset them was apparently no longer a crisis. The scent that had alarmed them was either gone or retreated. But my crisis was just beginning. I was beginning to understand that the property wasn't sealed, it was permeable. It had been designed to be permeable, and I was sleeping directly below the point of entry. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A vent I'd misidentified, an old renovation detail the Callahans didn't know about. Houses have secrets, old houses especially. I was in my guest room working on my laptop when it started, and I'm grateful I have notes, because what happened next would be easy to doubt later. On the evening of day 5, I noticed the bread. Half a loaf gone from a full loaf I'd bought at the Rancho de Taos grocery store the day before. I'd made sandwiches one afternoon, turkey and mustard, nothing fancy, and I use bread carefully. I'm not wasteful. I make lists, check them off, track consumption like my fieldwork has made me habitually aware of resource use in domestic spaces. I made a mental note and added it to my field notebook. Day 5 evening. Bread consumption, 1/2 loaf. Unexplained. The phrasing made me sound paranoid even to myself. On the morning of day 6, the other half was gone too. Completely gone. The bag sat on the counter, torn open at the top where someone had gripped it, and I was absolutely certain I'd left at least 2 inches of crust. I'd remember eating that much bread. I wasn't eating much at all. The isolation had made my appetite strange and small. Then, the bathroom towel. I always hung it on the same rack in the guest bathroom, the one attached to the wall by the shower. I'm methodical about those things. It's the kind of habitual precision that comes from living alone and always knowing where your things are, where every object belongs in the space you control. On the morning of day 7, it was damp. Not used by me damp. I shower in the evening, before bed, and I'd only showered the morning before, rinsing off the dust from my walk with the dogs. This was night sweat, morning moisture, the weight of a towel that's absorbed water from a human body. Someone had used that towel in the dark. Someone had turned on the bathroom light, or used it without light, moving by touch through a house they'd learned and mapped. I ran my fingers through my own dark hair and tried to think of explanations. Maybe I'd used it and forgotten. Maybe humidity was just high in the adobe, the thick walls retaining moisture differently than I expected. Maybe I was losing my mind in a house I didn't live in, on a property with no neighbors, with a closet hatch that wasn't supposed to exist. Or maybe someone was living in my walls. The Callahans had called back. The house plans showed no attic access from the 1960s blueprints. Someone had installed a roof hatch more recently, probably during renovations within the last 5 years, they said. They sounded confused but not particularly alarmed. They asked if I wanted them to cut the vacation short. I said no. I didn't want to seem paranoid. I didn't want to fail at a house-sitting job. I was being paid $400 a week for this and I needed the money, so I kept my discoveries to myself. But I wasn't sleeping well anymore. I was listening instead. On the 7th night, at 2 a.m., I heard creaking above my head. Not settling sounds, not wind in the eaves. Someone was moving. Slow footsteps, deliberate, crossing above the guest bedroom ceiling toward the living room. I lay there with my phone in my hand, brightness cranked down to nothing, trying to control my breathing. Each footstep was distinct, a weight bearing down on something, the slight give of old wood, the grind of footsteps on unfamiliar flooring. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a loose shutter. This was human. The dogs weren't barking. Coda was at the opposite end of the bed, pressed against the wall, and Juniper had gotten up somewhere in the night and was lying in the corner of the room, ears alert but body still. The cat was sitting at the foot of my bed, and when the creaking started, Mizo's head tilted up slowly. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring straight at the ceiling, her pupils dilated, her body absolutely rigid. And she stayed like that for the entire 3 minutes. The footsteps continued, tracking something I couldn't see. Then silence. Absolute, complete silence. Even the dogs didn't move. I didn't sleep. I did sleep. I woke up at 5 a.m. with my heart crushing itself against my ribs, and I made a decision. I was done rationalizing this, done convincing myself there was an innocent explanation. I propped a broomstick against the attic hatch before I went to bed on night 8. Not to block it. I'm not stupid enough to think a broomstick would stop an actual threat, but to know, to hear if it moved, to have absolute, irrefutable evidence that I wasn't imagining this, to have something I could tell someone and not sound crazy. The night of the 8th was quiet. I lay awake listening for 3 hours, then fell into that exhausted, fragile sleep that leaves you more tired when you wake up. At 3 a.m., the crash woke me like a gunshot. The broomstick had fallen. The hatch was cracked open maybe 6 inches, and there was something wrong about that open space. It was darker than the rest of the darkness, emptier somehow, like a mouth opening. I grabbed my phone and my car keys, and I left. I didn't pack anything. I didn't close the front door. I called 911 from my car, parked facing the highway with the engine running and all the doors locked, and I told the dispatcher there was someone in the attic. The deputies arrived in 12 minutes. 2 officers, professional and completely unsurprised by the call. They'd done property checks before in rural Taos County. They found the roof hatch on the back of the house, climbed into the attic with flashlights and caution, and what they found was a sleeping pad. Water bottles, several of them, arranged neatly. Empty food containers stacked like someone was keeping house up there. Binoculars. And Ray Gallegos, 55 years old, the Callahan's former property caretaker, who'd been fired 3 months before their Portugal trip for systematically overcharging them for materials and pocketing the difference. Years of small thefts, years of dishonesty. He'd been caught. Ray had worked for them for 7 years. 7 years of coming to this property, maintaining the 5 acres of grounds, feeding the animals when they traveled. Coda and Juniper knew him, trusted him, the sound of his truck and the smell of his work clothes, handling repairs and renovations, becoming part of the fabric of the house. And 2 years ago, when he'd done some roof work, he'd installed that hatch himself during what he'd reported as a routine roof repair, creating a permanent backup entrance to the attic crawl space that ran above the guest bedroom and living room. Access to everything. He'd planned for this, I realized. He'd installed his way back in before they ever fired him, insurance against the day he might need it. After they fired him, after they discovered his scheme and his overcharging and his years of small thefts, after they'd revoked his keys and his access codes and told him not to come back, not to contact them, not to expect severance, he'd been returning to the only home he'd ever really occupied. Not his own place, but this one. This adobe on Blueberry Hill Road where he'd spent more hours than his own house, where his labor and his care had built something he believed he deserved to keep. Using the roof hatch, sleeping in the attic on a pad he'd brought in sections through the hatch, using the bathroom when the house was dark and empty of witnesses. Taking food from the kitchen, specifically bread, I learned later at the trial. He liked bread. He liked eating it in the dark, in a space that wasn't his, in a house that had rejected him but whose walls still held his fingerprints. The notebook the officers found listed my schedule. What time I woke, what time I walked the dogs, what time I slept, what time I showered, what time I was in different rooms. He'd been watching me the same way I'd been watching the Callahan's life during my 3 weeks there. From the outside, observing, taking notes, maintaining his sense of ownership over something that wasn't his anymore. But I was a guest. I was temporary. He was something else entirely. The dogs knew his scent. They'd known him for 7 years, this man who fed them and brushed them and spent his afternoons on this property. But they knew something was wrong about his presence at night, his watching, his invisible occupation of their home. Animals feel violation the way we do. They just can't tell you about it directly. They can only warn us if we're listening, if we trust what they're trying to say. Ray's prosecution took 6 months. The Callahans cut their Portugal trip short and came back to deal with it. They stayed in a hotel in Taos rather than return to the house. I don't blame them. They couldn't sleep in a space they now knew had been violated, occupied, watched. My name was in the court documents, so was my schedule, photocopied from Ray's notebook and entered into evidence, pages and pages of observations. What time I woke, what time I showered, where I was in the house at different hours. Evidence that he'd been tracking my movements with the attention of a security contractor, the dedication of someone who'd studied this house so thoroughly he knew its rhythms better than I could ever know them. I had to testify about what I'd heard, what I'd seen, what the dogs had known. The prosecutor asked me specific questions about the bread, the towel, the creaking above the ceiling. Ray sat at the defense table wearing an expression of confused entitlement, like he couldn't understand why any of this was a crime. 7 years of service, 7 years of loyalty. The Callahans owed him. He was entitled to be there, to return, to watch. That's what his silence said better than any words could have. He got 5 years. Breaking and entering, stalking, violating a protective order he violated twice more before they kept him in custody. The Callahans eventually sold the house. I don't know who bought it. The takeaway isn't subtle, but I'll say it anyway because it's the reason I'm telling you this. When you fire a property manager or caretaker, especially one who's been with you for years, you don't just revoke their keys. You audit everything, every roof access, every crawl space, every hatch they might have installed during their tenure. You ask your contractors point blank, what did you do to this house? What permanent modifications did you make? What keys did you copy? What security overrides did you implement? You assume they left something behind, a way back in. Then you block it. Then you verify it's blocked. And if you're house sitting, especially in an isolated property, you request a full walkthrough before the owners leave. Roof, attic, crawl spaces, outbuildings, every access point, every corner. You don't take the owner's word that there's nothing to find. They might not know. They might be hiding something themselves. You trust the animals. If both of them refuse to enter a room, if they're staring at something you can't see, if their behavior changes in a space, you investigate. Not tomorrow. Not after you've decided to wait. Today. I've sat 23 houses since Ray. Never the same property twice. I've learned to listen to what the dogs are trying to tell me. I've learned to trust their fear. I've learned that isolation is dangerous when you don't control what's hidden in the walls. That matters more than I can properly say. I found the 4th bird on a Tuesday morning, and the moment I saw how it was arranged, I understood someone was watching me. The mourning dove lay on the kitchen windowsill, with its wings spread flat and pinned open with small sticks driven through the flesh. The head faced the glass, toward the interior of the house, toward me. Not discarded, not scattered, methodical, arranged like a message left on a desk. A cat doesn't do that. I've owned cats my whole life. I've watched what outdoor cats bring home, mangled, torn, sometimes half-eaten, dropped on porches or dragged under bushes. But this was different. This was intentional. This was someone saying something. My name is George Papandreou, and for 34 years I delivered mail on the same route in Mystic, Connecticut. The same neighborhoods, the same families. Main Street, Gravel Street, Holmes Street, the roads that curl down toward the Mystic River with its famous drawbridge, and the seaport just south on the water. You deliver mail for 3 decades on the same route. You develop a particular kind of attention. You notice which houses are renovated, which doors need wider clearance for the mail to fit, which families get checks from distant relatives, which kids go away to college and don't come back often. You remember faces across the years, the teenagers who become adults, the parents who become grandparents. You see the rhythms, the patterns, the anomalies. After I retired 5 years ago, at 57, I took up pet sitting. Word of mouth mostly, neighbors calling and asking if I could feed their cat or let their dog out while they traveled. I was reliable. I knew the families. I had keys to a dozen homes on streets I'd walked in every season for more than 3 decades. It was easy work, familiar work, work that let me stay connected to the neighborhood I'd spent most of my adult life serving. The Prescotts, Margaret and Robert, lived in a colonial home built in 1780, maybe half a mile from my apartment on Gravel Street. I'd delivered their mail for 34 years. The house was classic New England. 2.5 stories, clapboard siding weathered gray, a pitched roof, stone chimney running up the north side. The interior had original wide plank floors you could see when you looked through the windows, and Robert had converted a detached barn out back into a woodworking workshop where he spent his time on elaborate furniture projects nobody needed, but everybody wanted to look at. The property was bordered on 2 sides by a stone wall, pale granite, fitted dry without mortar, built sometime in the 1800s. The kind of wall you find everywhere in Connecticut, built by hand over the course of years, never straight, never perfect, enduring. Mystic itself is like that. Old money, old families, old structures holding their shape. The drawbridge that opens for boats on the river. Mystic Seaport, where you can walk through 19th century ships. Old Mystic Village with its tourist shops and the smell of salt water drifting up from the river. Noank, just across the border, a neighboring village that looks like it hasn't changed since the 1950s. This is Connecticut's idea of itself, coastal, historic, rooted, stable. That was the world where I'd spent my career. That was the neighborhood where the Prescotts lived. Margaret had called me in September, just before they planned to drive up to Vermont to visit family. Could I feed Duchess while they were gone? 10 days, maybe 11. Duchess was their cat, an outdoor cat mostly, kept busy with the birds and mice in the yard. Margaret had laughed when she mentioned it, almost apologetically. She's quite the hunter. She doesn't go far, but she does like to bring her gifts home. You might find them on the porch or the windowsill. Don't be surprised. I'd done it before. I'd sat for the Prescotts twice in the 5 years since I retired. Easy job, let myself in with the key, make sure Duchess had food and water, check the windows, lock up. In and out in 10 minutes. This time they left on a Thursday in late September, and I started coming by the next day. The first dead bird appeared on day 2. A sparrow, mostly intact, placed on the kitchen windowsill that faced the backyard and the stone wall beyond. The bird's head was tilted at an angle, its small black eye catching the light. I found it around mid-morning, cleaned it up with a paper towel, and threw it away in the kitchen trash. Normal. Duchess was an outdoor cat. Cats hunt. That's what outdoor cats do. They bring home the evidence of their kills like gifts or trophies. I logged it mentally but didn't think much about it. The second bird came on day 4, a small finch with yellow markings on its wings, placed almost gently on the same windowsill, as if Duchess had a preferred location for displaying her kills. The finch was fresher than the sparrow had been, its feathers still intact, no damage except for 2 small puncture wounds on the neck that could have been made by cat teeth. Again, I cleaned it up, replaced it in the trash. No alarm bells, just a cat doing what cats do. But on day 6, when I found the third bird, I was beginning to notice the pattern in a way I couldn't ignore. Always the same windowsill, the kitchen window facing the backyard, always relatively intact, suggesting they hadn't been killed in a frenzy or a struggle, always placed with a kind of deliberate care, arranged rather than dropped, that seemed slightly off even though I couldn't quite articulate why. The third one was a robin, larger than the others, and it was positioned with its wing extended, as if it had died mid-flight and been caught in place. I mentioned it to Carol, who works at the checkout counter at the market on Main Street and has owned cats her whole life. We talked during my morning walk, which I take every day regardless of season. Duchess is bringing in a lot of birds, I'd said. 3 in a week. That seems high for a single cat. Carol had waved a hand, unconcerned. One of ours went through a phase 2 years ago where she brought in 7 mice in a single week, then just stopped completely. Cats go through hunting phases, especially in the fall when all the migratory birds are passing through and fattening up before they fly south. They're easy targets. That was reasonable, logical. The kind of explanation that made sense if you thought about predator and prey cycles, about the rhythms of nature, about animals following their instincts. I'd accepted it, but I was also keeping count the way I'd learned to keep count over 34 years of noticing things. The mail carrier's attention to detail doesn't switch off just because you retire. It becomes part of how you see the world. You notice patterns. You file away data. You notice when something breaks the pattern, even if you can't immediately articulate what's wrong. The fourth bird changed everything. I'd arrived at the Prescott house around 9 in the morning on a Tuesday in early October. The light was thin and pale, the way it gets in New England in the weeks before winter truly arrives. The trees were beginning to turn, reds and oranges and yellows against a gray sky. I used the key Margaret had left, stepped into the kitchen, and stopped. The mourning dove was spread eagle on the kitchen windowsill, both wings extended flat, each wing pinned open with a small stick driven through the flesh. The bird's head faced the glass, faced inward, toward the interior of the house, toward the space where I was standing. It was arranged, displayed, meant to be seen by someone inside. I stood there for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, just staring at the bird without moving. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of an old clock on the wall. The sunlight coming through the windows cast long shadows across the wide plank floor. A cat doesn't do that. I was certain enough to stake my reputation on it. A cat kills prey. A cat eats prey or leaves it where it falls, scattered, abandoned, or hidden. A cat doesn't arrange prey. A cat doesn't use tools. A cat doesn't set up displays. Duchess wandered into the kitchen then, meowing for breakfast, and she walked right past the windowsill without even acknowledging the bird. She twined around my ankles, hungry, unconcerned, completely oblivious to the thing I was staring at, and watching her walk past it like it wasn't even there, like it was just part of the kitchen landscape, made something cold settle into my chest. Someone had done this while I was in the house, or while I was supposed to be checking on the house. Someone had come to the windowsill from outside and arranged this bird like a message. I took a photograph with my phone, my hand steady even though my pulse was rapid, and I called Robert. He picked up on the third ring, and I explained what I'd found. I kept my voice level and professional. I'd learned to do that over 34 years, to communicate problems calmly, to not alarm people unnecessarily, to be the reliable one that others could depend on. That's probably fine, I told him, but I wanted you to know. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear someone talking in the background. Margaret, I assumed. Then Robert came back on the line, his voice quieter than before. George, he said carefully, we should have told you. We should have mentioned it before you agreed to do this. Adam, our son, he has a restraining order. His mother and I, we got it about 2 years ago after an incident. He's barred from coming within 500 feet of the property. We haven't had any problems since then, no violations. He's been compliant. But before the order went through, he had a pattern. He would leave things, messages, warnings. We thought it was over. We thought he'd moved on. The restraining order changed how I understood everything about the past 6 days. I finished feeding Duchess and made sure her water bowl was full, and then I drove home thinking about what Robert had told me. Not panicked thinking, that comes later, but focused thinking. The kind of thinking a mail carrier develops when something about a route changes, when a neighbor stops collecting mail, when a familiar house goes dark. Pattern recognition thinking. I came back the next morning and looked at the bird again. It was still there. Robert hadn't called to say he'd removed it or made any arrangements. I photographed it again from a different angle and went through the house systematically, room by room, looking for anything else that seemed out of place. Nothing on day 7. But on the morning of day 8, I found the escalation. A dead bird on the kitchen counter, just inside the locked house. There was no way it could have gotten there on its own. Someone had used a key, they had a key, to unlock the door, cross the threshold, enter the space where I'd been standing, and place that bird on the counter. The bird was fresh, recent, Duchess was under the couch when I found it, crammed into the darkest corner, her pupils dilated, her breathing rapid. She wouldn't come out for treats or coaxing. She'd been frightened by something, or someone, or she'd simply sensed that something was wrong in her own home. That was the most terrifying thing about the bird inside the house. Not that it was there, but that the cat was afraid. I called Robert again, and he said he was calling the police. He and Margaret would drive back to Mystic that afternoon, and he apologized over and over for not warning me, not thinking about what might happen while they were away in Vermont, not imagining that Adam would escalate. But before they arrived on that morning of day 8, I did what my 34 years as a mail carrier had trained me to do. I did a full perimeter check of the property, not because Robert had asked me to, not because the police had told me to, but because something in my brain, all those years of attention, of noticing, of filing away small details about every inch of my route, was sending off signals that I was missing data. Behind the barn, in the overgrown section where Robert's old equipment was stored, I found 3 cigarette butts in the grass, all relatively fresh, all filtered butts from the same brand. I found something else too, a folding camping chair, the kind you take fishing or to the beach, positioned with a clear sightline to the house's back windows, the kitchen window and the bedroom windows on the second floor. The grass beneath the chair was flattened, matted down from repeated sitting. Pine needles from the tree overhead had accumulated in the seat and on the arms. Someone had been sitting in that chair, multiple times, for extended periods, watching the house, watching the windows, maybe watching me when I arrived each morning, when I let myself in with my key. I stood in that spot and looked back at the house, and I understood the full architecture of what was happening. The birds on the windowsill were messages. The bird inside the house was an escalation. The chair in the grass meant surveillance, meant someone was tracking my arrivals and departures, meant intent. I walked the perimeter of the property, paying attention to the stone wall the way I'd paid attention to mail slots and house numbers for 34 years. And I found a gap in the wall on the western side, where several stones had been dislodged or removed, creating an opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. That's how he'd been getting in. That's how he'd been accessing the property at night, how he'd been arranging the birds, how he'd positioned the chair, how he'd entered the locked house using a key that Robert said shouldn't exist. But Adam had a key. That was the worst part. He had a key. I called Robert again and told him what I'd found. The chair, the cigarette butts, the gap in the stone wall, the fresh bird in the house. He called the police immediately, and the detectives arrived within the hour. They photographed the chair, collected the cigarette butts, marked the gap in the wall as evidence. They told me to go home, that they would handle the rest, that I'd done exactly the right thing by documenting everything and reporting it. But before I left, I remembered something. A habit from decades of mail delivery, the automatic memory for details that I'd never really trained myself to have. It was just something that happened when you paid attention for long enough. A dark sedan, maybe 5 years old, Massachusetts plates. I'd seen it parked on Home Street, 1 block over from Gravel Street, positioned with a clear sightline to the Prescott property. I'd seen it on Monday afternoon. I'd seen it again on Wednesday and Thursday. Same car, same position, same angle. I'd noted the plate without consciously trying to OSH 4762. I gave the number to the detectives, and they ran it immediately. They found Adam Prescott in that car on Home Street that evening, parked and waiting, binoculars on the dashboard. He had a key to the Prescott house in his pocket. In the trunk, they found a cooler filled with dead birds, at least a dozen, preserved in ice, kept fresh for delivery. The restraining order violation sent him to jail, pending trial. The detectives told Robert that the birds were a known behavior pattern from before the order was issued. Adam had been leaving staged birds around his parents' property for months before the incident that prompted the restraining order in the first place. The detectives said it was how Adam communicated. I'm watching. I'm still here. I haven't forgotten. The escalation to surveillance in the indoor bird suggested that Adam was testing boundaries, seeing how much he could do before someone stopped him, before his monitoring took a step further that everyone was afraid to articulate. The Prescotts felt terrible. Margaret called me multiple times, crying, apologizing for not warning me about their son, about the restraining order, about the pattern of behavior that predated my arrival. Robert sent flowers. They offered to pay me triple the usual rate, though I refused. I told them honestly that I would have taken the job anyway. I would have shown up. I would have found the birds. But if I'd known what I was looking at, if I'd understood the context, I would have been watching for it from the beginning, instead of letting 6 days pass before the fourth bird made me understand what was happening. I don't do pet sitting anymore, not because I'm afraid. I'm not really, but because something about the work changed after that week in October. The noticing didn't stop. It never stops, not after 34 years of paying attention to every detail of a familiar route. But the noticing took on a sharper edge, a wariness. I see empty houses differently now. I see parked cars differently. I see neighborhoods differently, as if they contain layers I wasn't aware of before. Layers of surveillance, of escalation, of messages left by people who are determined to communicate something to the people inside. But here's what I want you to understand, and why I'm telling you this. If you're house sitting or pet sitting for someone, and that someone has a family member with a restraining order against them, you need to know about it. You need to know the face. You need to know what car they drive. You need to understand the pattern of behavior that prompted the order in the first place. You need to be informed. And when you're watching a property, you need to document the anomalies. A bird in an odd position, a chair in the grass, the same car parked on the same street 3 days running. Photograph it. Write it down, report it. Don't assume it's normal. Don't assume it's nothing. I spent 34 years as a mail carrier because I was good at seeing what was normal and what was different. That attention, that habit of noticing, that automatic memory for details, it saved the Prescotts from something worse. It saved me from something I'm not entirely sure I want to name. It doesn't take special training. It just takes the willingness to pay attention. The willingness to be the person who notices, the willingness to speak up when something feels wrong. The birds were a warning, but they were also a gift, a chance to see the danger before it escalated beyond messages left on a windowsill. Some people don't get that chance. I did, and I still remember every detail. The mourning dove with its wings pinned open, the camping chair in the grass, the cigarette butts arranged in a line, the car on home street, same plate, same position, day after day. The details are what save you. The details are what matter.